Varek had not carried a rider in 200 years. This was not a rumor. It was not a legend that had grown soft and uncertain with time. It was a documented fact, recorded in the Dragon Core registry, in the precise handwriting of 12 different record keepers across 2 centuries. Each of them had written the same thing on the same page, adding their date and their name to the list of official witnesses. Varek, bonded to no rider, status unchanged. 200 years is a long time to stay unchanged. Varek was the oldest dragon in the Empire. He was the color of iron in winter, that particular shade of gray that has no warmth in it, and his scales were larger than any other dragon's because 2 centuries of living had made him very large. He had been growing for a long time. He was still growing now, slowly, the way old things do when they have decided they intend to last. He spent most of his time on the upper platform of the Dragon Core stables, not because anyone had asked him to, because the platform was high enough that he could see the full length of the valley, and Varek liked to see what was coming from a long way off. He did not eat much anymore. This concerned the stable masters, who recorded his food intake alongside everything else. But Varek was 200 years old and he knew his own body, and he ate when he was hungry and not before. The stable masters wrote, "Refused morning feeding again," in their ledgers, and moved on with their days. What the ledgers did not record was what Varek did at the hours that fell between the official checks. What he did was remember. He had 200 years of memory to work through, and he worked through it the way old things work through everything, slowly and in no particular order, and with the full weight of attention that comes from having nothing more important to do. The rider he remembered most clearly was not the last one. The rider he remembered most clearly was the one before the last one, a woman named Isla who had ridden him for 31 years and who had understood, without either of them ever saying so, that the sky was not a place you went. The sky was a place you were. Isla had been gone for 90 years. Varek still felt the particular weight of her on his back when he was being still. He was being still most of the time now. The Dragon Core handlers were afraid of Varek. They did not say this. They wrote, "Varek, caution required, approach protocol in effect," in the official manual, and taught the new recruits to stay 3 body lengths back and make no sudden movement. The recruits learned. They stayed back. They watched Varek from the distance the protocol prescribed, and they did not come closer. This is the story of what changed. Emperor Cael had been trying to reach Varek for 11 years. Not ride him. Cael was precise about this distinction in his own mind, and precision mattered to Cael in ways that other things no longer did. He did not want to ride Varek. He understood that was not his to want. What he wanted was to reach the dragon, to stand in the enclosure without Varek retreating to the furthest wall, to have the dragon look at him with something other than the careful, measuring regard of a creature deciding how much distance to maintain. Cael had become emperor at 24. He was 35 now. In 11 years of rule, he had learned to manage most of the things that came with the position. He had learned to read people quickly. He had learned to make decisions without the certainty he would have preferred. He had learned to sleep on the difficult nights, which was harder than any of the other things, and he had done it by developing the habit of going to the stables at midnight when the core was quiet and standing near Varek's platform in the dark. Varek always knew he was there. Cael was certain of this. The dragon was too old and too perceptive to miss a person standing 20 feet away, but Varek did not move toward him and did not move away. He simply oriented one eye in Cael's direction and held it there, and Cael stood in the dark and held his ground, and they spent the midnight hours in that particular proximity. It was not nothing. It was not what Cael wanted, but it was what they had. The Dragon Corps commanders had given Cael their honest assessment 3 times. Varek was not going to bond again. They had tried their best riders. They had tried young riders, experienced riders, riders who had bonded with other dragons before. They had tried riders who approached with confidence, and riders who approached with patience. They had tried riders who brought food, and riders who brought nothing. All of them had been turned away, one by one, until the protocol of 3 body lengths was established and became the official position of the Corps. Cael did not argue with the assessment. He kept it in its folder and kept going to the stables at midnight, and kept standing in the dark, and Varek kept orienting that one amber eye in his direction, and neither of them moved from that arrangement for 11 years. What Cael had not done was look at the stable workers. He knew they existed. He knew the stables required people to maintain them, and that those people were employed by the core. He had simply never considered them as a variable in the equation of Varek. He would, later, think of this as a significant oversight. Senna had been working the North Stable for 4 years. The North Stable was where the non-bonded dragons were kept, which meant it was also where Varek was kept. Senna had been assigned to it because she had applied for stable work, knowing which assignment she would get. The senior workers took the bonded dragons. The junior workers took whatever was left. Varek's platform was always left. Senna was 24. She had grown up 2 days' ride from the core grounds, in a village that sat under the flight path the dragons used going east to the mountain ranges. She had spent her childhood watching them cross the sky at altitude, their shapes enormous even from the ground, and she had grown up with the feeling of watching something that was happening in a different world from hers. The dragons were real, but they were not for her. Her mother had been a core rider for 11 years before Senna was born, and for 6 years after. When Senna was 7, her mother's dragon, a young female named Dusk, had lost altitude on a return flight after a long patrol. The fall had not been Dusk's fault. A crosswind had caught them at the wrong angle on a descent they had made 100 times before. Her mother had survived with a broken back and a dragon that had been grounded for 3 years recovering. The bond between them had changed after that. It was still there, but it had something in it that had not been there before. Senna had watched her mother walk differently through the world after the accident. Careful, always listening for wind. Senna did not become a rider. She had thought about it, for a period in her adolescence, the way you think about things you know you will not do. Then she had thought about it honestly, about her mother's careful walk, about the way Dusk had looked in the years after the fall, about the fact that a crosswind could happen on any descent, and she had decided that what she wanted was to be near the dragons, without giving them the part of herself she did not want to lose. So she worked the North Stable. She cleaned the enclosures, and maintained the feeding schedules, and kept the records, and learned the non-bonded dragons one by one, which was slower and more careful work than learning the bonded ones, because the non-bonded ones were not oriented toward humans the way bonded dragons learned to be. She had to earn each small acknowledgement individually. She did not mind this. She had time, and she was patient, and she understood that being near something, and not asking anything of it, was its own form of relationship. Varek was the last of the North Stable dragons she had approached. She had left him last deliberately. The Dragon Corps ran an open recruitment 3 times per year. Senna had not intended to apply. She had looked at the announcement posted on the stable board. Candidates wanted, bonding potential assessments, all backgrounds considered, and she had thought about it for 2 days, in the way she thought about most things, carefully, without reaching a conclusion, until the conclusion arrived on its own. The conclusion that arrived was, she would apply not because she expected to bond, but because the assessment would tell her something she did not already know about herself. She wanted the data. She filled out the form. The assessment was in the main hall. There were 9 other candidates that session, all of them younger than Senna, most of them with some previous dragon exposure. A core assessor took each candidate through a standard sequence. Approach a bonded dragon, present the open hand, hold the position, note the response. Senna watched the others go before her. Most of the bonded dragons acknowledged the candidates with moderate interest. 2 of them backed away. 1 showed actual curiosity, which the assessor noted carefully in the record. When it was Senna's turn, the bonded dragon they used for the assessment, a young male named Torch, looked at her with the same moderate interest he had shown most of the others, then turned away to investigate something on the far wall of his enclosure. The assessor noted this. He did not say anything unkind. He said, in the tone of someone delivering a neutral fact, low bonding signal, not a recommended candidate for formal training. Senna said thank you and left. She walked back through the main corridor of the core building, past the candidate board where the other 9 applicants were still clustered in small groups comparing notes. She did not stop. She had her answer, and she was thinking about what it meant, which required more space than a corridor offered. She went back to the north stable. She picked up her cleaning tools and went to work on the near enclosures, starting at the south end and working her way north the way she always did, methodical and without urgency. She thought about the assessment while she worked. Low bonding signal. She turned it over. She was not sure she disagreed. She had never felt what she thought the bond was supposed to feel like. She had felt something with the non-bonded dragons, the gradual accumulation of small acknowledgments that she had been building for 4 years. But that was not bonding. That was something else. Something she did not have a technical name for. By the time she reached Varek's section of the stable, she had finished thinking about the assessment. She set down her tools at the entrance to his enclosure. She picked up the broom. She began. Varek watched her sweep. This was not, by itself, unusual. Varek watched everything. He was old enough that observation had become his primary occupation. He watched the clouds change. He watched the handlers at their 3 body-length distance. He watched the bonded dragons on the lower platforms when they returned from flights, reading the quality of each landing to determine how the flight had gone. What was unusual was the quality of attention he gave to Senna. Senna did not look at him while she worked. This was not a strategy. It was simply how she worked, focused on the task, methodical, not performing awareness of the other presence in the space. She swept from the south entrance to the north wall in overlapping rows, picking up the loose scale fragments and the bits of old feeding material that accumulated daily, working around the support posts with the slight adjustment of angle she had learned was most efficient. When she reached the north wall, she turned and swept back. Varek was sitting on his platform 12 feet above the floor level. He could not feel the vibration of the broom the way he would have felt a heavy footstep, but he could feel the small, consistent rhythm of it, and after a while the rhythm became familiar. It was not threatening. It was not demanding. It was simply present. On the 3rd day, Varek moved. He did not move far. He shifted from the back of the platform to the edge nearest the work floor, which brought his head 8 feet closer to the ground level and put him in a position where he could see the sweep pattern more clearly. He settled there with his chin on the platform edge and watched Senna finish the south row. Senna did not react to the movement. She noted it. She continued sweeping. On the 5th day, she began talking while she worked. Not to Varek. Not to anyone. She simply started narrating the task to herself in a quiet voice, the way she had occasionally done in the other enclosures when she was working through a problem and needed to hear her own thinking out loud. She talked about the sweep pattern. She talked about whether the feeding schedule for the dragon in the adjacent enclosure needed adjustment. She talked, briefly, about the assessment, saying aloud that she had thought it over, and she still was not sure what low bonding signal meant in practice. Varek's eye moved toward her voice and held there. By the 3rd week, something had shifted. Senna noticed it the way she noticed most things, not in a single moment, but an accumulation of small observations that eventually added up to a pattern. Varek was at the platform edge every morning when she arrived. He had not, in her 4 years at the North Stable, ever been at the platform edge in the morning. He was always at the back of the platform in the morning, doing whatever it was he did alone in the hours before the work began. She did not comment on this. She picked up her tools and began the sweep, and talked about whatever was in her head that day, and Varek watched from the platform edge, with his chin resting on the stone, and his amber eye tracking her movement. Eleanor Roosevelt once wrote, "You gain strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you really stop to look fear in the face." Senna was not brave in the way the word is usually used. She had not overcome a dramatic fear. What she had done, over 4 years of slow work, was stop performing safety around the non-bonded dragons and simply be present with them. This was its own kind of courage. It was quieter than the dramatic version, but it lasted longer. On the 14th day, Varek descended from the platform. He came down the access ramp slowly, the way large things move when they are being deliberate about their own weight. He reached the stable floor and stood there. He was, at floor level, considerably larger than Senna had previously understood from the platform height. His shoulder was above her head. His tail reached the full length of the enclosure. Senna stopped sweeping. She stood with the broom in her hand and looked at him, not at his eye, which was the thing the training manuals said to do, just at him, the whole of him, the way she would look at any large and complex thing she was trying to understand. Varek looked back. Then he walked to the south wall of the enclosure, turned around, and lay down. He put his chin on the floor. He watched her from there. Senna stood still for a moment longer. Then she resumed sweeping. She said, in her talking to herself voice, that this was a new development, and she would record it in the morning log. It happened on a Tuesday. There was nothing special about the Tuesday. The weather was the mild gray of early autumn. The other stable workers were doing their rounds. Senna was in Varek's enclosure for the morning clean, and Varek was on the floor near the south wall where he had taken to resting, and she was working the upper storage ledge that ran along the north wall at 12 feet, because one of the feeding containers needed relocation. The storage ledge was accessible by a fixed ladder. Senna climbed it, moved the container, and was coming back down when she noticed that the ledge ran to a point directly above where Varek was lying. She also noticed that from this height, the curve of Varek's back was approximately at her level. He was that large. She stood on the ledge for a moment. She thought about what it would feel like to step across. Not dramatically, the way you think about a practical decision before you make it. She considered the distance, which was manageable. She considered Varek's back, which was broad and stable-looking. She considered that she had been in this enclosure every day for 4 years, and had never once thought she would be standing on a ledge at this angle making this particular calculation. The thing she noticed was that she was not afraid. She had expected to be afraid. She had spent 7 years being careful around the memory of her mother's fall, keeping a certain distance from the thing itself, even as she worked around it every day. But the fear was not here. She was standing 12 feet above the stable floor, looking at the back of a dragon she had been quietly learning for 3 weeks, and she felt the same quality of attention she felt when she was working, present, unhurried, focused on what was actually in front of her, rather than on what might go wrong. She had not planned anything. She had no plan. She was simply standing 12 feet above the stable floor looking at the back of a 200-year-old dragon that was lying quietly in the morning light, with his eyes half closed. She thought about the assessment. Low bonding signal. She thought about her mother's careful walk. She thought about the 31 years Ela had ridden Varek, and what the sky must have been. Then she stepped across. She moved from the ledge to Varek's back in one careful step, the way she would step from one solid surface to another, and she settled her weight onto him as gently as she could manage. She sat there. She did not hold on to anything. She just sat. Varek did not move. He breathed. She could feel his breathing, the vast slow rise and fall of it, like the tide coming in at a very great distance. He did not lift his head. He did not pull his wings in. He simply continued to exist, calmly, with her on his back. Senna sat there for a long time. The morning light shifted through the enclosure openings. Somewhere below, another worker was moving through the adjacent stalls. Varek breathed. "All right," Senna said quietly, to no one in particular. "All right." The first person to see Senna on Varek's back was a junior handler named Brix, who had come to do the adjacent enclosure check, and had stopped in the doorway and stood there with his mouth open for a full minute before he went to find the senior stable master. The senior stable master, a woman named Orla who had been with the Corps for 22 years, came back with Brix, and stood in the doorway and looked at Senna sitting calmly on Varek's back, and said nothing for a considerable time. Orla knew the protocol. And she also knew that protocol existed to prevent dangerous situations, and that the situation she was currently looking at was not dangerous. Varek was calm. The measurement of Varek's calm was not subtle. A dragon in distress is a different creature entirely, all tension and noise and movement. Varek was the same Varek he always was, just with a person sitting on him. Orla recorded this in her log and sent Brix to report to the Corps commander. The Corps commander sent a runner to the palace. Senna did not know any of this was happening. She was sitting on Varek's back, thinking about the feeding schedule adjustment she had been considering for the adjacent enclosure. After a time, she shifted forward, then back, testing her balance. Varek made a sound. It was not a sound she had heard him make before. It was not the sound he made when the feeding was late, or the sound he made when something on the adjacent platform disturbed him. It was lower than both of those, and continuous, vibrating up through his back into her legs and her spine and her hands, where they rested against his scales. It came from somewhere very deep in his chest. She sat very still and let it move through her. She thought later that the word for the sound was not something she could look up in any of the core manuals. The manuals described vocalizations in terms of warning and appetite and distress. None of those categories fit. It was, she decided, approximately the sound of something very old being briefly less alone. She stayed until the morning clean was supposed to be done. Then she climbed back to the ledge and down the ladder and picked up her broom and finished the remaining section of floor. She made her notes in the stable log. She wrote, Varek. Descended again, a loud approach to back, no distress signals observed. She did not write that she had sat there for 40 minutes feeling the tide of his breathing move through her like something returning. Emperor Cael had been watching for 3 weeks. This was not something he had announced. He had come to the stable in the early morning, on the day a core clerk had sent him a note, cautious in tone, hedged with qualifications, saying only that something worth observing might be developing with Varek, and he had found a position on the observation walkway above the north stable, and he had stayed there. He had watched Senna sweep. He had watched her talk to herself while she worked. He had watched Varek descend from the platform on the 14th day and lie on the floor. He had watched the gradual shortening of the distance between them, day by day, not forced, not performed, just the natural movement of two things that were slowly learning they did not need to maintain the distance they had started with. He had watched the climb. He had been on the walkway when Senna stepped from the ledge to Varek's back. He had held very still. He had watched Varek not move. He had watched Senna sit there in the morning light for 40 minutes with her hands in her lap, and no particular expression, just a person sitting somewhere she had been allowed to sit. He had felt something happen in his chest. He did not examine it immediately. He was accustomed to feeling things and filing them for later examination. What he examined, later, was this. In 11 years of standing in the dark near Varek, he had never once tried to simply be in the space without asking anything of it. He had always been there with the wanting to reach the dragon, to close the distance, to have the 11 years of midnight visits mean something. He had never been there the way Senna was there, with the sweep pattern and the self-narration and the 40 minutes of sitting quietly on the dragon's back because she had happened to be at the right height and she had decided, in that moment, to simply step across. Cael came down from the walkway on the Tuesday afternoon, after Senna had finished her notes and returned her tools to the storage room. He walked into the enclosure. Varek, who had returned to the platform, oriented his eye downward. Cael stood in the enclosure and looked at the space where Senna had been sitting. He looked at the floor where Varek had lain. He stood there for a while. Then he went to find out who the stable worker was. Senna was in the feed storage room sorting the next morning's preparations when Emperor Cael found her. She knew who he was. Everyone who worked the core grounds knew the Emperor by sight. She set down the container she was holding and turned to face him and did not quite manage to decide what to do with her hands before he spoke. He said, "I was watching this morning." Senna said, "I know. Orla mentioned it." He said, "How long has this been building?" Senna thought about it. She said, "The morning conversations started in the 2nd week. Before that, it was just the sweep. So 3 weeks of regular contact. But I have been working this stable for 4 years, so the earlier time counts too, I think, just at a greater distance." Cael looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "The core assessment told you that you had a low bonding signal." Senna said, "It did." He said, "Does this feel like a low bonding signal to you?" Senna was quiet. She thought about the 40 minutes on Varek's back. She thought about the tide of his breathing. She thought about the sound he had made, low and continuous, from somewhere in his chest. She said, I do not think I was bonding with him. I think I was just there with him. I am not sure those are the same thing. Cael said nothing for a moment. Senna watched something move through his expression, not quickly, but fully, like weather moving across a very large space. He said, For 11 years I have been standing in the dark near him, wanting him to come toward me. Senna said, That might be the problem. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. Senna had spent 4 years building a tolerance for the specific silence of being near something very old and very patient, and this silence had a similar quality, not empty, just waiting to see what would happen next. Cael said, Would you come back in the morning? Senna said, I am assigned to the north stable. I will be here either way. He said, I know. I meant, would you let me be there? Senna looked at him. He was precise and contained, and there was something in his face that he was not hiding exactly, but had not expected to show. She recognized it. It was the look of someone who had been maintaining a distance for a very long time, and had just realized, watching someone else, that the distance was self-imposed. She said, The sweep starts at 7th hour. You are welcome to stand wherever you like. She picked up the container she had set down, and finished sorting the morning feed. Cael stayed in the doorway. He did not go back to the palace that evening. He went to the observation walkway, and stood there in the dark, until the stable grew quiet. On the platform above, Varek was awake. He had been awake, Cael realized. Every night he had stood here. The dragon had always known he was there. Varek had simply been waiting for Cael to stop wanting and start being present, the way Senna had been present, the way Isla had been present, 31 years and 90 years ago. The sky outside the stable opening was full of stars. Cael stood in the dark and looked at them, and for the first time in 11 years, he did not think about reaching the dragon. He thought about 7th hour, and the sweep pattern, and a woman who talked to herself while she worked,